Thank you for being here today. This is being recorded and we'll post it on the Multiple Measures Assessment Project website. So we are covering quite a few things in this workshop, this webinar. And so we wanted to just really quickly, I'm Mallory Newell, I'm at De Anza College, part of the Multiple Measures research team, joined today by Craig Hayward and Terrence Willett, also members of the Multiple Measures Assessment Project team. So what we wanted to cover for you today is I'm going to just do a really quick review of the validation requirements for AB 1705, which are required in the template submission. And then Craig is going to review the recently released Business Administration Associate Degree validation report that he worked on, which also meets the validation requirements if you so choose, and we'll talk about that. Craig will also talk about how to replicate the statewide analysis locally. And then I will review the data submission template for the colleges who are choosing to not accept the statewide validation and submit their local validation. And we say potentially questions and answers, that's if we have time and if we are able to answer your questions. So we're not able to answer all of your global AB 1705 questions. Those are more for the Chancellor's Office. We're specific to the research report and the data submission template and replicating the statewide analysis. If you do have a question that's specific to the Chancellor's Office, we do recommend submitting it to AB 705 at cccco.edu. So 4 C's and an O.edu. We will, and Terrence will be monitoring the chat, and so he'll try to be responding to as many of your questions as possible. So moving on to the AB 1705 reporting requirements. So the requirements were detailed in 3 different locations. So the AB 1705 initial guidance memo was sent out in December of 2022. There was a follow-up implementation guide, so how the Chancellor's Office expects colleges to implement AB 1705. That was sent out in March. And there was an AB 1705 FAQ, which is very detailed. So if you do have outstanding questions, I would recommend looking through those 3 documents prior to kind of submitting them maybe to the AB 705 email, because your questions should be answered in those 3 documents. Timeline for AB 1705 reporting. So within the law per ed code, it states that July 1st, so this summer. All right, so July 1st is the legal deadline, but in the Chancellor's Office memo, they said that since they were getting out the guidance kind of late in the year and colleges were wrapping up their terms, that they would accept the submission from July 1st through September 1st. So that gives you more flexibility, especially since the form needs to be approved by your academic senate president and so on. All colleges must complete a certificate form, even if you're not choosing to do local validation, because there's 2 action items that are required, and we'll get into those. But if you are just going to be accepting the statewide validation, you just need to submit the form for the action item 1, and we'll get into that. But all colleges must complete a certificate form, a certification form. So required action 1, this is the required action that all colleges have to submit the certification for. So U.S. high school graduates or equivalent, so a GED equivalent, shall begin in transfer level English and math quantitative reasoning coursework. And so this largely applies to programs with English or math quantitative reasoning requirements. And then as a college, you can choose from 2 options. And this is also similar to the options on the form. So you could choose A, which is continue or implement the default transfer level placement into English and math with no pre-transfer level enrollment. So if you have no pre-transfer level enrollment, everyone goes in to transfer level English and math, then you would select A. For B, you're going to continue to implement the default transfer level placement enrollment into English and math with limited pre-transfer level or non-credit enrollments restricted to programs serving students exempted under the law. And there's a big list of those exemptions. And so I would recommend you go to the guidance memo to see that list of exemptions. And if you are going to allow particular groups to enroll in pre-transfer level placement, you must clearly define and implement a mechanism for restricting access for any students other than those exempted from the law. So you actually have to have a way to only allow those who are allowed to take those classes under the law into those courses. So that's required action 1, which all colleges need to submit on the compliance template. Required action 2 is really optional depending on the college's choice. So required action 2 under the law states that students shall begin in the transfer level English and math course that satisfies the course requirements for the student's intended major. So it's a certificate, associate degree, or transfer. And so validation is required for any transfer level prerequisites preceding the gateway English or math course. And this is what needs to be taken care of this year. These are for non-STEM programs. For STEM programs, they have an extended timeline to next July. So that validation process won't take place until next summer. This largely applies to students in transfer level math courses associated with lower division requirements for the major. So we did a catalog review. We did not find any programs outside of math, though we do recommend that colleges audit their degree and transfer pathways to make sure that you're not missing anything. So anything that may have a transfer level requirement prior to the completion of the transfer level course that is required within their intended major. And we'll get into that a little bit more. What does that mean? So this is the required action 2. So in order to ensure compliance with required action number 2, you can choose 2 options. You can ensure access and enrollment and support in the Gateway Transfer Level course for every program. Or you can validate that the prerequisite, the transfer level prerequisite, meets the standards of the law by acting in accordance with the statewide validation or through completion of a validation template. So the statewide validation is what Craig's going to walk you through today, or through the completion of the validation template. If your college chooses not to go with the statewide validation report, then you can submit your own data through the template. Okay. So if you will not have any pre-transfer or any transfer level prerequisites, you would select A. You don't need to go any further. If you're going to continue to have the transfer level prerequisites, you need to move on to B and either accept the statewide report that Craig's going to walk you through or submit the data template. So in continuing on, if the transfer level prerequisite to the gateway course is not validated, then your college shall not require or recommend the prerequisite to students. We have gotten the question like, well, what if students just choose to go into that class? That's not an option under 1705. It cannot be recommended or required. And then the U.S. high school graduates shall begin in the gateway course when they begin coursework in English or math. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Craig to start us off on the Business Administration Associate degree.
So the Multiple Measures Assessment Project research team took a deep look at specifically business administration students, because this is the largest program where there are kind of, I should say, non-STEM program where there are off-map prerequisites that are not part of the actual program coursework. They don't fulfill a requirement for that program, an explicit requirement to receive that degree in business administration. So this is where we see college algebra, pre-calculus, potentially also trigonometry as prerequisite courses to business calculus, as well as another applied calculus, or the regular calculus course, which also can be used to satisfy these requirements, the calculus requirement for a business administration degree. So that kind of orients us to the group of students that we're focusing on. And so we've got a series of research questions that we investigate and that provide the basis for this, the guidance in the memo. The first question is simply, are students with lower levels of high school math preparation highly unlikely to succeed in business calculus if they enroll directly in that course versus, say, their throughput or their success if they enroll in a prerequisite class like college algebra? So that'll be the first thing we look at. Next, we'll take a look at whether starting in a transfer level prerequisite will actually improve the probability that students will complete calculus. So, maybe the students weren't highly unlikely to succeed if they went directly into calculus, but maybe throughput is still improved or higher if they start in one of those prerequisite classes. So we'll make that comparison as well. We looked at throughput in two different timeframes, the official 1-year throughput timeframe, as well as an extended timeframe of up to 10 years. So we just didn't impose a deadline, but cohorts that started more recently, had less time to complete, but so that it's a variable timeframe. So we call that the extended timeframe. And as you might expect, you see higher throughput when you extend the time frame beyond 1 year. So that's an additional perspective that we'll fold in here and share with you. And then we are also looking at something we're calling conditional throughput, which means for those students who successfully make it through the prerequisite courses, so they complete college algebra, they complete pre-calculus, and they then enroll in calculus, right? So we're sort of eliminating the attrition component. What is the throughput if you kind of condition that throughput on the fact that they made it through the prerequisite course? So that gives us a very different perspective, and I think an instructive and helpful perspective. We'll talk about that when we see that. So finding number one was that students here, I'll just go right to the graph. None of the students that we looked at were highly unlikely to succeed if they enroll directly in business calculus, regardless of their level of high school preparation. We do see, a pretty strong association of increasing throughput as the students, attain or achieve higher levels of math completion in high school. That's obviously a good thing, and we want to see more of that. But we don't see anything that looks like a level of highly unlikely to succeed, the lowest being 47% throughput rate within 1 year for students entering into business calculus. Now, these are, again, specifically business administration students who need this class or something comparable to complete that program. So that gets us sort of past the first hurdle. So let's look at the second hurdle, if you will, or the second test. We're going to see which pathway has higher throughput. And if you're a betting person, this is where you can start to make odds and lay your wager down as to whether that prerequisite pathway has higher throughput or direct enrollment into calculus has higher throughput. So without further ado, let's take a look at the results. And here the results quite clear. The bar that is the kind of the yellow-orange bar, that's much higher than the other bars, is the result for students who enter directly into a calculus course. So this is any first level calculus course here. And then it's further disaggregated by the highest level of math they completed in high school along the x-axis. And then the groupings in each cluster of bar charts or bars indicate the math that the student started in, that business administration student started in when they entered community college. So on the far left of this graph, we have the students whose highest level of math completion in high school was geometry, and they entered either into the blue bar, would show their throughput, their 1 year throughput rate if they entered at the college algebra at the community college. The orange is if they entered into trigonometry at the community college. And the gray is if they entered into pre-calculus at the community college, which is about a 9% 1 year throughput rate compared to a 53% 1 year throughput rate for students who enter directly into that that first level calculus course. And the numbers go up from there. The gaps stay quite large. So this is the 1 year time frame. I can see there's a bunch of questions, or at least there's something going on in the chat. So we'll take a look at that in a minute. Finish kind of going through the findings here, and then we'll circle back. So finding 3, this is where we extend that time frame, as I mentioned earlier, and allow for longer time periods for students to complete. And when we do that, the discrepancy between entering into one of the prerequisite courses and entering directly into a first level calculus course is diminished somewhat, although and the overall success rates go up for all of the categories as well, but the gap is still quite large between the students who enter into one of these prerequisite sequences and the students who enter directly into calculus, first level calculus at the community college. Again, kind of regardless of their level of math, highest level of math completion in the high school. Although there's that overall main effect for students to do better, of course, as they complete more math in the high school, which is desirable. So let's wrap it up here with our last finding that we're going to share today. So this is the finding on conditional throughput rates. So again, this is when we look just at the students who made it into calculus, regardless of whether they started in a prerequisite or started directly in calculus. So for the students that start directly in calculus, it's not any different than the numbers we've already seen. But for students who start in the prerequisite level, it makes a very big difference. And the reason this perspective is sort of important or meaningful to think about is that this really reflects what you would see in the classroom in teaching one of these classes. You know, the students that walk in the door who've come up through the sequence are these students that are in this graph that I'm about to see. And so that shifts your perspective on kind of the effectiveness of those prerequisite trajectories. Because if you're teaching in the classroom, you might tend to think that students who come up through those sequences tend to have higher success rates. But this is conditional throughput. It's conditioned on the fact that they made it all the way into the calculus class and through the prerequisite sequence successfully. And this is in the extended time frame. So kind of the higher levels of success are represented here. But what you're missing when you look at it that way is the fact that that view kind of disappears all of the students who suffered attrition or have not persisted into the calculus pathway, which are the majority of the students who start in those prerequisite classes. So it's helpful to have a specific example. So this is the example of business administration students with a 1 year throughput. Let's look at the students starting in either directly in business administration or in college algebra, whose highest level of math in high school was geometry. If they start in any introductory class, they have a 53% 1 year throughput rate, when it's 61% if you extend the time frame. If they started in college algebra, students whose highest level of math in high school was geometry, their throughput rate in 1 year is 9%. Their extended time frame throughput rate is 15%. So if these 641 students in the sample, these business administration students whose highest level of math in high school was geometry, had started, if they'd all started in calculus instead of in college algebra, we would expect 53% of them to have completed calculus. That's 340 students. That's nearly 6 times as many completers relative to the 57 that did complete within 1 year. So this is the substantial impact of kind of changing the way that we think about assessment and placement to take into consideration the throughput rate, which includes not just pass rates or success rates in individual courses, but that sequence, which factors in attrition. So overall, business administration students were far more likely to complete a calculus requirement for their program when they started directly in a calculus course than if they started in one of those transfer level prerequisites like college algebra, trigonometry, or pre-calculus. And these were consistent across every level of high school math preparation and all transfer level prerequisites. So this analysis does suggest that business programs are losing through attrition large numbers of capable students who could be completing due to the prerequisite structures that have been developed. So it's a powerful lever to get more students into and completing these programs. The ability to place students directly into these first level calculus classes, of course, with concurrent support that is allowed and encouraged, and so that it's not like developmental support needs to go away entirely. It's just being shifted into a concurrent form, which means that you elide or eliminate those attrition points that are causing a lot of the trouble with the traditional prerequisite sequences. All right, should we pause there, Mallory? Do you think? It looks like there's a bunch of questions in the chat before we get into the replication.
I think the one question that's just outstanding is, was there anything, and did you happen to look any more at the geometry, the high school geometry cohort, the 105, if you did any additional disaggregation on that group?
The 105, I'm not sure where that number's coming from, so I might have to circle back on that.
Yeah,
I mean, we had 641 in the group that I was just talking about, so I'm sure there's 105 in there somewhere.
But the rest of them we've been answering as we go.
105 was the number that was quoted for like the 47% passing rate.
Mm-hmm.
So it was those geometry students that were directly placed into calculus. I believe that there was some mention about over about a 10-year period, but really no further data about where they came from, what their other experiences were.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, I get what you're. Yeah, we don't have that on hand, and we do have other data that would describe that cohort. So, perhaps we wanted to look at, disaggregate that group by ethnicity, which is something I'm actually working on right now. So that we'll have those results soon. Just FYI, the data points we have are limited to what is available in MIS, CCC Apply, and then some high school data from CalPass. So we don't necessarily have every data element that you could potentially want to look at, but we do have a number of useful descriptive statistics for these students that will be we can crack open. So, okay, sounds like that was the one outstanding question. So I'm going to go on into how to replicate what I did with the state level analysis, and what many of you on this call may be, already are working on, or thinking this is something that you need to be working on shortly. I think the good news is working from your local data system at a college eliminates a lot of the struggle of working with a statewide data set. So these steps are at a pretty high level. We can follow up if you have questions, or if you want to get into more detail about some of the specifics. But let me walk you through it at this 30,000 foot level first, and see where that takes us. I'd also be curious if people on the call envision any of these steps posing sort of a substantial problem, or if they all seem relatively attainable, manageable, and reasonable from your perspective where you sit at your campus or your district. So the first step is to create your data frame for the right time frame for these students. So to replicate the statewide analysis, that would be summer 2013 through summer 2022. And that's just the basic sample and data frame. We can get that as one student per row, no duplicates. And then we're going to add the kind of following variables to this basic data frame. We're going to look at their highest high school math completed. This could be from CCC Apply self-reported data. It could be from the multiple measures placement service, which combines self-reported data and CalPAS transcript-based data. Or it could be from, whatever system you're currently collecting that information from, but all campuses should have access to that information for your incoming students at this point. And then we code the high school math into the following 5 categories there on your screen. Also bring in high school GPA. We did do multivariate analysis that combined the high school GPA and the highest math completed, and it confirmed the findings in the bar graphs that we showed earlier. It's just a little bit more complex, but valuable and interesting. And then, as we were just talking about, Nick, the descriptive variables that we want to use for disaggregation or to understand, the characteristics of the students in the sample. So for instance, ethnicity, gender, you might want to include age, other equity categories that are of interest can be included there. And then this last check mark is the latest program of study. This is obviously really important because we're going to be focusing our analysis on business administration. You can also fold in economics ADT students. So those students who are pursuing those particular programs of study would kind of then be the filter of this data frame. And that's going to reduce your sample size a lot. For us, it reduced it, from looking at everybody regardless of their program. It cut out, over 90% of the cases, and we just really zeroed in on these business administration students. And that's another area where your data at the local level is better than what trickles up into the NYS. A little emphasis on that last point, that's important. Then we're going to identify all of the students' math class enrollments at the college. So this data file will be 1 row per enrollment. So we need to know the term of enrollment. We're going to want to know descriptive data about those courses, course ID, the short course title, the course control number, if you have it. That's probably less important, again, at the local level. The course units, I put max if you have a variable unit course, you just take the max there. And then we're going to want to know the outcomes for each class enrollment or each class section. So what was their final grade mark, the outcome? What's the relevant grade points for that? Translate that into a success indicator, code that as a 0 for a non-success, a D, F, or W, or a 1 for a passing grade. The registration status is also important to look at to make sure you're only including students who have valid census enrollment. Now you essentially have 2 files. You have one with 1 row per student and one that has, with all of the demographics in it. And now you have one that has all of their enrollment data in it. So working with the enrollment data file, you would then compute a set of enrollment variables for each course of interest. So we're going to have a set of variables that describe pre-calculus, a set of variables that describe trigonometry, if you have that class, a set of variables that describe finite math, if you're interested in including that. And we did look at finite math, but that's sort of on a separate level because it doesn't have prerequisite, so it's not affected by AB 1705 the way Business Calc and Calc 1 are. Then you're going, as you're creating sets of variables to describe each of these classes, you're going to use a prefix or a suffix to identify them. You can go back to step 1 to see the variables to include with each prefix or suffix. So this is just an example of code. In this case, it's SPSS code, creating a set of calculus variables where we're using a prefix to describe this set of variables as calculus variables or calculus college. Again, you probably don't need that at your college because you know which college you're at. Calculus course ID, calculus course title, calculus course mark letter, calculus year term code, which is basically, the MIS term code or year with the term code appended. So 2013-5 would be summer of 2013. I'm sure most of the folks on the call are probably very familiar with all that. The course units attempted, whether they were successful in that class. And then just a quick frequency check to see what those variables that we just created look like. Okay, there are definitely a couple of different ways to come at this next step. What I did is I then used the aggregate command to essentially compact or aggregate all of the values for those new sets of variables that we created for each course so that they're present in every row of the data set. And then that allows us to have to delete the repeated rows and keep only the first. Keep the first is probably a good idea. I keep the first instance of course taking. So that's the initial course, math course that the student took. And now you have associated with that, that one course record, all of their math course taking with the prefix codes. So after you run this aggregate command, you'll have, and this is an example, you need to have longer command to aggregate for all of your course sets. You now have one row per student, all of their math course taking, and then you can append that to or merge that rather with your demographics file, and you're pretty much good to go. So this is probably the most complicated step here. So if you haven't done this kind of thing before, you might have questions. If you probably have other ways of coming at that, I'd be interested in hearing how you might approach that in other languages, especially if it's simpler or easier, and we can share that out with the field. Now we get into the analysis, okay, and it's actually pretty simple. We've done the hard part at this point. So we're going to run a cross tabulation to generate some tables that are going to show us the values that we need in order to conclude the analysis. So I'll show what you will get from those tables. These contingency tables here show us essentially the data that we were looking at earlier. So there's the calculus 47% throughput rate for students who start directly in calculus at geometry or below. So that kind of gets you in 6 steps through the replication of the MMAP research that we presented earlier. All right, so how are we doing with questions in the chat? Should we take a minute? How much time do we have? We're actually doing pretty good on time.
We're doing good on time.
Yeah, we could see if there's some methods questions. There is a question going back, way far to the beginning about compliance, but I want to, if we have time, we'll go back to that one in a little more detail. But let's see if, Oleg and I think James also, they're, talking about colleges of small ends, right?
Yep. Yeah. Even a large college, some of these, we don't, I mean, the bottom line is you don't see huge numbers of students completing high school with only geometry, right? If you're looking at that, and then going into, calculus or really even any of these transfer level classes, although they're probably more likely to go into the pre-transfer, or sorry, the prerequisite transfer level classes than directly into the calculus classes. So the sample size could be small for local validation for some of those groups, for sure. Yeah, I'm not sure that we have the sample size question is always kind of a sticky one. You can expand, there's certain things you can do. You can expand the years that you're including. You can include, your economics program if you hadn't included that. Although that tends to be quite a bit smaller than the business administration program most places, but it could add a few more students. Yeah, I mean, when I've looked at, I've just seen a few of these at the college level, and they seemed very similar. But yeah, kind of grouping might be the next thing to do, kind of combining students who complete geometry with students who complete algebra 2, for instance, to at least get a larger sample. Might be one thing you could try.
Well, and I thought you were going to suggest, oh, well, go to a bigger college.
Well, it occurred to me you could, have like a consortium of colleges too, right? You can
Actually,
bundle
that's
some
a great
colleges
point.
together.
Yep.
It's, obviously it's more work for you to do that.
Okay, then we got a live question here for you, Craig, from Craig to Craig.
And that's a Craig to Craig communication. Yeah, this is one that you grapple with any kind of research design. So this is ultimately, it's not experimental data, it's correlational data. So there could be X factors. But what I can say is that similar approaches to this have in effect panned out experimentally, right? Like when we looked at AB 705, that same question was raised about, could you really be suggesting that students should all be starting in transfer level? And while I understand there's still differing opinions about the impact, I think some of that comes down to your perspective, right? And I feel that for faculty who are teaching in the classroom who are experiencing a decline in success rates, that it may feel like AB 705 is not an unqualified success, right? What is going on? This is a much more, students with a much more diverse set of backgrounds. They're less homogeneous coming into this classroom. Many of them are struggling. Now, if you look at it from a throughput perspective, you realize that we're losing many, many fewer students, and many, many more students are making it through. So we have applied this logic to similar circumstances in the transition from high school to community college. And kind of experimentally, it's been shown to kind of hold water or hold up. So I think that would be probably the strongest evidence to point to that we can probably expect that this would work as well. The other thing that you have the benefit of when you're using the statewide data is just the large variability among colleges and how students get placed into different courses. So students across all 115 colleges tend to have kind of a bell curve or a highly variable set of all of those different background characteristics at each level of placement. So it's not so much that there's one dominant set of characteristics defining each student by their placement level, that those characteristics are actually really mixed up quite a bit across all of those placement levels. You get that more when you have the statewide analysis. at a college, there's still some of that going on. A lot of times people tend to think assessment and placement is kind of an ironclad, channel, but it's really much more porous than that. The assessment and placement, students kind of sort and they fight back against the system in different ways, or they get different guidance, or they talk to different counselors, and they end up in different placements almost unexpectedly. And that variability is actually really helpful for this kind of analysis. So having said that, I'll be quiet. Terrence, it looks like you wanted to add your 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, it's just briefly, it's not an experimental design, so there's these challenges, and so we try as much as possible to control for differences in background variable. But I also wanted to address another of Craig's questions, and I see John Hetz is in the room. So I'm going to pick on John Hetz a little bit to see if he wants to field this particular question. And the short version of it, where in the law does it say students can't backplace to lower levels of coursework? And John has historically had a good response to that.
Well, I mean, there are a variety of ways to respond, but let me do the practical one of where it says in the law. It says in a variety of places that colleges have the responsibility to both place and enroll students into the first course that applies to their program of study. It says that in multiple places. So it's the college's responsibility to help provide the support and get students into that course. So the whole reason, not the whole reason, one big reason why you see the words enrollment all over AB 1705 is specifically to address this problem, which is, do we allow students to place themselves further back? Do we allow guided placement to place them further back? Do we allow self-placement to place them back? Do we allow them to choose to go backwards? And the point of AB 1705, the reason you see enrollment everywhere there is that it's our responsibility as institutions to make sure that those students start in the course for which their program of study starts. The other really important reason that I would say that there is a fair amount of evidence for, Frederick No has done a variety of work on this. When you provide that types of flexibility, when you allow some people to backplace, who does it? Well, it's the students who have been told their whole lives that they don't belong in higher ed, that they're not good at math. And that tends to be underrepresented students of color, low income students, and in mathematics, women. And so if you do that sort of thing, you're essentially saying, you're agreeing that you're going to allow something that has known negative equity impacts on the students in mathematics, and you want to lean into that. So it's both very explicitly built into the law, and it's contra to everything we stand for as a community college system. How was that, Terrence?
That was good, very clear, I think. And I think, there's concerns about this whole policy and law, right? Let's get real about that. And we're seeing some of that come in. I think another way to phrase it is we're in a challenging time where opening access has seen a great increase in the number of students completing overall, with the commensurate decrease in success rates in classes. And so there's this, I think Craig was alluding to this too, this different experience in the classroom versus what you see at the aggregate. And it creates, it's one of several tension points. And there's also questions about, what about a student who dropped out in the 6th grade? What are they supposed to do? And I always point out that we partner up with adult ed, and there are adult education pathways in the state, and every one of our colleges is part of a consortium. And they have pathways to learn those skills in English and math and other subjects to prep them for the college experience, and encourage folks to develop collaborations between your faculty at your colleges and the adult eds as well. But just acknowledges there's a lot of challenges here as well. But I know we have to get through some practical things too, right, Mallory, about the data template submission. So we'll keep on the chat, keep up the questions, and we'll hit them all as we can, either now or follow up later.
All right, thank you so much. So I wanted to move on to the data template submission. I just wanted to reiterate in the chat that if you feel that results that Craig just went through for the statewide analysis do not apply to you, or you have an additional program, say economics, that you need to validate, then you'll be using the data template submission. So you'll be conducting the analysis locally and then submitting that analysis here. So just for a little bit of interaction, we have 95 participants. Just maybe raise your hand if you know that your college will be submitting the data template and validating their data locally. You could just do a quick poll in the chat if you know your college is going to be submitting. Got one so far.
How about people who don't know yet? They need to see the template before they decide.
All right. Well, at least we got one taker so far, but we'll go through it and we'll ask questions along the way to make sure you understand it. We have a little less than 15 minutes to go over this last piece of it. So again, these are for the colleges that are choosing not to go with the statewide results that Craig just walked folks through. Or if you have an additional program, say economics, that you also need to validate, or you could apply economics, the economic outcome. You could apply the statewide analysis to economics as well. So required action 1, this is for all colleges. So you need to either pick option A or option B, and we already went over required action 1. And this is really just indicating to the chancellor's office if you are continuing to offer any of the pre-transfer level enrollment. So option A, our college will have no pre-transfer level course enrollments except co-requisites to transfer level courses after July 1st, okay? Or option B, that you're gonna still continue to have pre-transfer level courses that are not co-requisites or transfer level courses for some student groups that are allowable under the law, and that your college will clearly define and implement a mechanism for restricting enrollments just to those particular student groups. So that's required action item number 1. So everyone needs to submit that. And then required action number 2 is the one that will be also everyone needs to submit. And then if you're just selecting option number 1A, you don't need to go any further. So required action number 2, so this is actually a screenshot from the template itself. So if you're, so we'll just go through it. So by July 1st of next year, your placement and prerequisite policies, your enrollment practices and academic support structures ensure that students in non-STEM programs begin in the Gateway Transfer Level English and Math course for their intended program when they take their first English or Math quantitative reasoning course. So you can choose from A, B, or C. A, our college is compliant. We do not have placement policies, prerequisites, or advising patterns for non-STEM programs that result in students enrolling in transfer level coursework below the Gateway English or Math course for their program. So for example, if you have a business administration program or an economics program, and students are required to take business calculus, and then if you were choosing option A, then students would go straight into business calculus without taking any transfer level prerequisites such as college algebra, trigonometry, pre-calculus. Option B, our college plans to make changes to our processes in order to be compliant by July 1st. So you're in that space where you're making those changes. And then option C, your college is going to submit data for at least one non-STEM program in an effort to verify that transfer level prerequisites to Gateway Math or English courses improve the student's likelihood of completing the program requirements. So this is where you're going to be submitting your own validation study. So that's option C, right? Let me just really quickly, Terrence, are there any questions around these first two pieces that we want to address?
No, I'm seeing people asking other questions.
Okay, great. So if you are choosing option C and you want to validate your data locally, now you're moving on to the data submission. So you're going to use the template to submit the data for each Gateway course for which a transfer level prerequisite needs to be validated. Okay, so if you have a prerequisite for business calculus and another course, then you would need to submit it for both of those courses. The Gateway course is defined as the lowest transfer level course that satisfies the requirements of the student's intended major. Okay, so that first level transfer level course, that's the requirement for their major. For example, if an associate degree for economics includes applied calculus, the course requires some students to take college algebra before having access to applied calculus, then the college will need to validate the college algebra prerequisite. So there's your example there of what applies. In order to submit the data template, you need to complete the template for each gateway course for which you're trying to validate a transfer level prerequisite. If you have several programs that have the same gateway course, so for example, business administration economics likely both have applied calculus or business calculus, you can complete the template for the gateway course only once and report the program's cohorts in the aggregate. So you could choose to report them separate, or you could report economics and business administration together because they both require applied calculus. If a gateway course for a program has more than one transfer level prerequisite option, complete the template twice. So if you have two different transfer level prerequisites, you need to submit for both of the pre-transfer level prerequisites. For each gateway course within a program that has a transfer level prerequisite, the template provides instructions for defining the cohort and the time frame, the cohort count, and so on. So we're going over those now, but when you go back, there's definitions within the template itself. All right, so the first piece is the program name. So enter the program or degree name, for example, Business Administration AST or Business Administration AA, if it's your local degree, or economics. So whatever the program or degree name is for your school. And then if more than one program shares the same gateway course with the transfer level prerequisite, enter all the program names. Okay, so for example, if the Business Administration AST and the Economics AAT both have business calculus, and business calculus at your college has a transfer level prerequisite, enter both degree names, okay? The gateway course ID and title, so that should be pretty self-explanatory. If the transfer level gateway requirement can be satisfied with more than one course and you plan to report completions across multiple courses, include the course ID and course title for all courses that meet the gateway requirement. So for example, if the gateway requirement is applied calculus again, but students can satisfy this requirement by taking STEM Calculus 1, enter information about both calculus courses if you plan to report the completions across both calculus courses for students in the program. So some colleges will allow students to take applied calculus or calculus 1. And so students in that pathway, you could aggregate their outcomes. They could complete either of those and be part of the successful completion cohort. Then you want to report the transfer level prerequisite course ID and course title. So now you just did the gateway course. Now you're doing the transfer level prerequisite course title and ID. Okay. Starting and ending time frame. So you can define the starting and ending time frame, but you just need to be explicit about when that cohort started. So for example, if you want to start in summer 2019, and track them through spring 2022. So you can give them a whole year to complete, but you can have multiple cohorts over that time frame, but just be specific at when was your starting time frame and when was the ending time frame. Okay, so that the chancellor's office can know what your starting and ending time frame is of your cohort that you're choosing. The next item that you report are the number of unduplicated students in the cohort. And so unduplicated means that they're only counted once. So you're entering the number of students with that declared program of study. So similar to how Craig had to identify those students with a business administration program of study, you may have to do some legwork to figure out how to identify students by their program of study. And you want their first enrollment in the discipline. So they have not taken a math, in this case, a math course before. This will be their first enrollment when they entered the transfer level prerequisite. So if your transfer level prerequisite, say, is pre-calculus, they had not taken anything at your college prior to pre-calculus. That's their first enrollment. And then if multiple programs have the same transfer level prerequisite for the same gateway course, you can combine those cohorts. And there's an example there, but we are running out of time. Terrence, any questions you want to raise up?
I think we've got them handled. A lot of good suggestions about follow-up research and questions about how to support students or how do we help students who are struggling. and failing, things like that.
Okay, great. So I'll keep going then. So then there's about 2 more things you have to report on the template. The number of students who successfully complete the Gateway course within 1 year. So again, these are the number of students within your time frame who completed with a C or better at your college, the Gateway course within 1 academic year, and that can be up to 4 academic terms. It's up to you how you define your year. When they start in that transfer level prerequisite. Okay, and so you can have cohorts that span multiple years. So say you have a cohort that starts in fall 19, one that starts in fall 20, and one that starts in fall 21. But make sure that you're tracking each cohort for just a year. You're not tracking now 3 years within that cohort. Each year, each cohort gets 1 year to complete. And then you want to have the completion rate of that Gateway transfer level course. So in this case, it's the throughput rate. So it's the number of students who successfully complete the Gateway course divided by the number of students in the starting cohort. So who were your starting students and how many of them completed that Gateway course? And that's going to be your throughput rate. So the template walks you through these instructions here. We do have some additional resources available. All of the implementation guides and the FAQ can be accessed at the first link. And then the report that Craig went over can be accessed at that second link. We can stick around for a little bit if people have some burning questions, but otherwise, we've got through everything that we got through. Hopefully we answered all your questions. If you do have outstanding questions, you can email them to ab705@cccco.edu.
Yeah, and there's a couple of questions at this tail end. I got to use a little brain power, so let me. We'll get back to you, Preeta. And okay, John's helping out as well. So if we've gone quickly. Please keep up the questions, and we'll get your responses.
John, anything you wanted to add to conclude, or Craig?
I don't have anything specific to add other than appreciate everyone engaging and coming to these types of meetings, to ask the questions and start to do the important work. I think there were some questions earlier about like the highly unlikely to succeed standard. There's a fair amount of work out there on, probabilistic language or words of estimated probability. And the standards on that are, they're variable. They are, there's some wiggle room in those estimates. But when you look at things like highly unlikely, most places are pegging that down close to 5 to 10%. The IPCC, that puts out all the information on climate change, they use very unlikely as less than 10%. When you look at when people ask other people, something that both Craig and I and this team has done, ask people in the field, what do you think highly unlikely means? People land between 5 and 10% pretty regularly. And so there's meaning to those words that are pretty relevant in this context. And that's been a standard that's always been there.
Yeah, just thanks to everyone for coming out and engaging and for all of the great work that you're doing, and really appreciate you. So.
And we will be posting this on the RP group multiple measure assessment project website.
Are there any guidelines about what constitutes non-STEM? I know that a lot of them, like biology, chemistry, are pretty straightforward, but there's edge cases like agriculture or things like that that might be helpful to have some guidelines on.
Terrence and I, we've gone through all of the programs in the state and at the top code level and categorized them as either STEM, technical, which is kind of closely related to STEM, but STEM tends to be more transfer oriented, whereas technical tends to be more terminal, kind of work, career oriented. And then the healthcare is another category that's kind of like STEM adjacent, but isn't considered STEM. But there, unfortunately, what you find when you look into this, and sounds, Stephen, like you've probably looked into it, there is no one golden standard of what is STEM and what is not STEM. So it takes that sort of careful attention. The non-STEM, what is non-STEM is basically all the programs that aren't STEM. So I could put it that way, but But then you have to define your STEM programs, right? And with STEM, you've got the center of the bullseye, like you said, right? That you've got, engineering, you've got biology, you've got physics, you've got mathematics, chemistry, physical science. There's a host, and you'd be happy to share kind of ours with you, but it's it'd be nice if there was a standard, but it's one that we kind of have to develop. And there's actually Associate Vice Chancellor Valerie Lundy Wagner did some great work on this. She wrote a paper a few years back that I've referenced myself, so I can share that with you as well.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, just shoot us an email or drop your email in the chat and I'll get it.
Yeah, and Wendy put in a good comment too, like, the federal government, they have their definition, and like Craig and I have noticed, like sometimes they include psychology as STEM and sometimes not. And so that is it's fluid, right? A little bit.
Right. So I think a good place to start is transfer model curriculum that require the CID for single variable calculus, right? So that's a good starting point. Other courses that are in that same general area, those would be generally speaking STEM courses. If you have a question about a program, or STEM program. If you have a question about a program, whether or not you should treat it as STEM or non-STEM, again, sending that to 8705 would be a good way to disambiguate that.
Thank you. Can you repeat the first part of what you said about the single variable calculus?
Right. So most of our colleges have a single variable calculus. It may have early transcendentals. Also, it's the CID 210.
Yeah, there was a question too about CIDs, and there are some people that have concerns about where the UCs and CSUs going to stop accepting our classes, for example. And AB 705 has been around for 5-ish years now, and we haven't had, that I've heard of, any case of an articulation being denied, and the systems are aware of our laws. I know it does cause a lot of concern. I've heard it directly from my articulation person. And so that's where it's also helpful. Like in my college, our senior administration, the president said, well, let them try to deny an articulation and I'll fight them. But there are, John, I know, and there are, cross-segmental discussions, and they're aware of this. I don't think there's any intention of denying student transfer.
I mean, it's one of those things that there's always the possibility of rogue individual institutions. But this is something that Dr. Lowe is tracking very closely and very seriously to make sure that the systems themselves are fully informed, and the articulation officers of those systems are also informed. As any of you who've ever tried to get something articulated to a CSU or a UC, that can have some variation, as can the disarticulation decisions. But that's not something we take lightly, and we are very carefully tracking that.